Phil, we've been talking about this for so long, and I know my listeners have been waiting to hear about bioregulators because I'm always talking about peptides and the benefits of peptides. But now we're into not a totally different realm than peptides, but bioregulators are kind of like the next big thing, and they might even overtake peptides in what they can do and their effects on the body. So thank you for jumping on here and bringing us your knowledge on this.
Oh,
And
my pleasure.
I can't wait. I can't wait. So let's just start off with the big, broad question.
Okay,
What are bioregulators?
good one. If
Yeah.
anyone knows, please let me know. No, I'm only kidding. No, basically, it's a term that's been developed by Professor Vladimir Kavanson and his team, a very long and established institute that resides in St. Petersburg. And basically, there are two things. Well, firstly, what is a peptide? Well, a peptide is made up of amino acids. So the moment you get two amino acids that are conjoined, you have a peptide. That's called a dipeptide. And some people say in the medieval swamp, that was the moment when they conjoined it, you had information, you had instructions. So bioregulators, peptide are short chains of amino acids. So what we're talking about are 2, 3, or 4 amino acids. They are particularly short because, of course, there are lots of peptides out there, BCP 157, just to name one, that are much longer. And you might get into, I know, semirelin, for example, and of course, we change the names as the amino acid chains get longer. We might call them proteins. We could even end up calling them hormones. So human growth hormone being 191 amino acids. And of course, when the chains get very long, they get problematic in the delivery. In other words, you couldn't swallow them and expect them to go through the stomach. You would have to inject them, or maybe use them as a nasal spray or some other means. But these very short chains, 2, 3, 4, they do pass through the stomach, so they are bioavailable even if swallowed. And there's all the studies out there, because what we're talking about used to be a Soviet military secret, and they were playing with these 30 and 40 years ago. So they have masses of information, a lot of which is now in English. And the other thing that makes them very unique, and this is the hardest part to understand, to be honest, and I think even Professor Kavanson and his team haven't really elucidated as to why they have this effect. What's the special thing about bioregulator? Because there is a gazillion 2, 3, and 4 chains of amino acids out there, peptides, but they're not all categorized as bioregulators. So in this meaning, if we take, for example, the thyroid, a lot of the adult population, as you know, Amy, is hypothyroid. They don't produce enough thyroid hormones. So if you take the thyroid peptide bioregulator, it would activate genes that would endogenously make your own thyroid gland make more thyroid. But weirdly, if you were hyperthyroid, in other words, you had too much circulating thyroid, the same peptide silences the same genes to bring you down. So it bioregulates. Somebody said to me recently, it sounds like an adaptogen. And I had to say, actually, yes. And I would even go as far to put a theory out there that it could be that these adaptogen plants contain some of these peptides, because what we're talking about here is throughout nature, in plants, in animals, in us.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that about the adaptogens, because I thought the same thing. When I heard you on Ben Greenfield's podcast describe specifically, and I was super happy that you brought up the thyroid bioregulator, that it can literally bring someone from a hyper state down to normal and bring someone from a hypo state up to normal. And that is fascinating. And it doesn't matter how many adaptogens are out there on the market, supplementally, nothing hits the thyroid like that. I mean, that is just flat out amazing. It could actually change the way that we do treatment for hyper or hypothyroidism, any kind of thyroid disease.
Yeah. I'll say one caveat, okay? You have to have the gland, right?
Okay.
If you've lost your thyroid, if you've had it removed, the peptide isn't going to operate for you. It needs the gland there. I know there are handfuls of people. I know, thankfully, it's not many people, but it does happen. And there are other peptide bioregulators like the testes, the prostate, the ovary. Again, you have to have the gland. Yeah, if the
Right.
ladies take the prostate, won't work. If the gentleman takes the ovary, won't work.
Right.
So, but that's just a handful of them. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It is very, very unique. And it also, I think, helps to explain. I spoke to Professor Cavenson not that long ago, a few months ago, and I asked him in the 40 years it had been on the Russian markets. And when I say Russia, I mean Russian speaking countries. It is in the Ukraine, it is in Kazakhstan and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks they've been dosed over 100 million times. Okay, so originally it was designed for their elite troops, it was designed for their cosmonauts, and it was designed for their Olympic teams.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, since Russia's changed in the 90s, the market has become commercialized. They're on those markets as food supplements, not the injections, but
Right.
the actuals are on the market as food supplements. But the injections are used in clinics as well. That's something you want to get into that. We'll get into that. And as a result, they're on wide use. And the amazing thing is, in all that time and in all those uses, they have never documented a serious side effect. And it could be because of this bioregulation. So coming back to the thyroid again, you could imagine that if you're going to be taking a thyroid medicine every day,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's T3, T4, or maybe ARMA,
Mm-hmm.
the desiccated natural thyroids, you would have to monitor yourself because you are literally putting the hormone in, right?
Right.
So sensible people would want to make sure they're not going to supralogical levels and possibly down regulating their own thyroid gland from any production. I mean, that does happen in different glands. But the peptide works in a very different way. You're not putting the hormone in you, you're putting in a peptide which acts as a gene switch, which enables your own thyroid to produce more and in balance, you could argue as well, right? T3, T4, T1, T2, the forgotten thyroid hormones, as I like to sometimes refer to them.
Same.
Yeah, thank you. So,
That's what I call them too, Phil. I love that you just said that because I call T2 the forgotten thyroid hormone because it does so much, but we can get to that. Right.
yeah, no, cool. And I think that's also why prior to the peptide, my favorite, because I used to be a pharmacologist, and so my favorite, as I like to say, I'm a recovering pharmacologist, but my favorite was the natural thyroids like Armour,
Mm-hmm.
and it was only fairly recent. I thought the reason that most patients seem to do much better on those than something that was pure T3 or T4, especially T4, of course, and we can go there, but was because it contained all four of the pig, porcine glands. But I found out only a few years ago that the pig thyroid, I'm sure you know this, is bioidentical to the human.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly the same, which is unusual. That doesn't happen with animal hormones very often for obvious reasons. So I think that's another feather in its cap for
Mm-hmm.
desiccated thyroids. But in this case, what we're talking about, of course, is a very different matter. But there are two choices in the peptide world. The first choice is, of course, you have a synthetically produced molecule, okay? And then the second choice, of course, is you have a naturally derived molecule. So it is actually possible to get these natural peptides from cows and pigs, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So bovine and porcine, but they're filtrated to such a point that you're getting just the peptide. And I always say, folks, because they always raise it, of course, will I get mad cow disease from it? No. Well, firstly, in 100 million doses, it's never been seen, but it's impossible because to get a prion, you have to have a Dalton-sized molecule, which is fairly large in the world of chemistry, and the peptides are nano-sized; they're tiny by comparison. So there's no the animals are healthy anyway, but beyond that, the filtration system means that no prion could pass into the product. So I think it accounts for their very good safety profile.
Very nice. And one thing I have to circle back on so I don't forget when you were mentioning about not having a thyroid. So I do have listeners that have had a total thyroidectomy, radioactive iodine treatment on their thyroid. What about those who have Hashimoto's and over the years, their thyroid gland has slowly been destroyed and it's kind of teeny tiny right now? because it's just been eaten away by their own body, for lack of a better description. Would the bioregulator still be something? And we're not saying go off your medication, but would the bioregulator still be something that they could bring in to potentially get a little bit more optimized in addition to their thyroid hormone replacement?
The short answer is, in the majority of cases, yes. There are potential issues with people who suffer from very potent autoimmune issues, in that they shouldn't go on to the peptides too quickly. They should slow down their approach. And of course, those who are on medications already supporting their thyroid glands, we have to say monitor yourself extra carefully, because you may, if you're putting in, I don't know, whichever hormone you're using, if you're going to add the peptide, you're going to encourage your own thyroid to produce some more, maybe not as much as you'd like if you have a greatly atrophied thyroid because of Hashimoto's, but there should be some impact. And because of that, you may need to reduce the medication that you're on. It's something to be aware of. Or hopefully you might come off it, but at least, monitor yourself extra carefully during that time.
Definitely. I think that's important to note too, as well, because people they'll pile it on. I mean, they'll take the bioregulators and they'll keep taking their meds, and they might go hyper.
Sure.
So,
I'm sure sorry for interrupting you, Amy.
no,
I'm sure and I'm sure through your great podcast, you've maybe told this story, but forgive me if I tell it again. I quite like looking back at the old-fashioned ways of doing things. Yes, blood tests are wonderful, and it's great. Keep doing them. But before there were blood tests, what did they do? And of course, thyroid is an amazing thing, because, as you know, it's very much involved in our temperature regulation. Sorry, I'm going to speak Celsius. You'll have to get the calculator out.
Go ahead. Yep.
But these are the numbers in Celsius. So when you get up in the morning, get a thermometer, first thing you do. And of course, it's so easy now. Put it on the forehead, stick it in the ear, and note your temperature, and do that every day for about 2 weeks, and see what your typical number is. And you'll be amazed how close those numbers will be. But you should be, for a healthy thyroid, you should be between 36.3 and 36.7 degrees Celsius. Okay. Now, if you're regularly under 36.3, and some folks drop into 35s, you are hypothyroid. You have a weak thyroid. And of course, should you be regularly over 36.7, you're hypothyroid. But it's so unbelievably accurate. And whatever you do in your regimen, whether it's taking iodine, eating seaweed, taking armor, or using the peptide bioregulator, whatever it is, if you keep monitoring your temperature, you will see the change, the incremental 0.1 Celsius change. It's quite remarkable. Quite remarkable.
No, it is. And that is the old school way of doing it. And actually, one could argue possibly more accurate, because we know when, especially over here, well, I have patients all across the world, so I see it everywhere. Doctors will only test that thyroid stimulating hormone marker, that TSH. And we know that can be wildly inaccurate. So now we have someone walking around with low body temperature, they're gaining weight, they're losing hair, they're constipated, and they're not getting diagnosed. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. So the bioregulator will work across the board. The only caveat is you have to have the gland. But even if you mentioned something earlier, Phil, I want to circle back to it. For those who don't have the thyroid gland, all hope is not lost, because there are bioregulators for adrenals, now I was talking with Nat Nidham, love her. I know she adores you. And she was saying for the thyroid, and maybe you can expand on this, that there would definitely be other bioregulators we would want to add in, not just thyroid.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about people without thyroid glands, it would be quite a different program. But if we talk about people with thyroids who want what we call a synergistic program, in other words, to take other agents that will boost the whole program. Well, I did an interview with Professor Cavenson some time ago now, and we did a number of different issues, problems, disorders, and there was one peptide bioregulator that was synergistic with all of them. There were other groups, other things, don't get me wrong, but there was one that was synergistic with all of them. And when we think about it, it's not really a surprise, because that is the blood vessel. And the blood vessel peptide basically is helping the delivery of blood to the cell throughout the body. And if you think about that, if you're delivering whatever tissue it is with more blood, it's going to be delivering more nutrition, and it's going to be removing more toxins. So anybody who wants a boost to their thyroid program, I would say, yes, go in and also take the blood vessel, and you can take them at the same time. I'll be happy to get into dosing and cycling and all the rest of it whenever you want to. So that is a definite one. And you hit the nail on the head just a moment ago, the adrenal. And there are a handful of the peptides that what I've seen in many people, fast results, and big results, and the adrenal is one of them, without doubt. But when you think about it, again, perhaps it's not a big surprise when you stop and think about how many hormones do the adrenals produce, right? A lot.
Yep.
A lot. And I think a lot of people out there are familiar with the phrase adrenal fatigue, which, say come 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they're exhausted, they want a nap, and it never was like that before, and they haven't changed their program. It's adrenal fatigue, it's a burnout. And of course, should also mention, a lot of the ladies who are entering their menopause, it's one of the problems they have, that as their estrogen levels decline, the body kind of burns the adrenals a lot harder. So again, adrenal support for the ladies of that age is a good thing, I think.
Definitely. And then what would you say about other autoimmune conditions? So let's say a person has Hashimoto's, which we know in the thyroid world, 95% of all hypothyroidism is autoimmune related anyway. So what else should we be doing for that autoimmune component?
That's a good question. There is another peptide that I personally love, and I think it's got quite a long story behind it, and that's the pineal peptide bioregulator. Now, this spins us off into the story of the pineal gland, which I think is a tremendous story. I'll do the 10-second tour. I think most folks know it's a pea-shaped size thing. It's in the middle of our brains. If you draw a line across the top of your ears and the middle of your forehead, that where they dissect would be where the pineal is, give or take. The Hindus, of course, paint the bindu, the third eye, which is a representation of the pineal gland. There's lots of esoteric things involved with the pineal gland, which I won't mention unless you want me to. But fundamentally, there's one thing. There's not just one thing, of course, like with all hormones, but there is one thing that the pineal gland is very responsible for, and that's the production of melatonin. And melatonin is in our blood when it's dark, i.e. when we sleep, and it is an instruction to the rest of the endocrine system to know when it's night and when it's day. And that gets us into our circadian rhythms. And we all know how bad we feel if we miss 1 or 2 nights sleep or whatever, or if we're doing shift work, or we're doing a lot of jet lag, plane travels. And of course, if you have a nice, healthy circadian rhythm, you have hormonal cyclicity. And if you have hormonal cyclicity, you have a good immune system. So now we begin to see how fundamental the pineal gland is. A marvelous man, I know him well, Dr. Walter Pierre Pauly, who's a world melatonin expert, wrote all the early books about pineal and melatonin and stuff. He once said to me, and I've never forgotten it, he said, think of the pineal gland as the conductor of the endocrine orchestra. And if you have an orchestra, in this case, all the other hormone glands, and you'd have no conductor, what do you have? Well, you make noise. But if you have a conductor in the orchestra, you make music. So coming back to the peptide, it will help us endogenously, that is to say, inside our own bodies, not exogenously. I mean, you can take melatonin as a tablet, of course you can. But by taking the peptide, you're invigorating, you're activating the genes, and you're helping your own pineal gland to make more melatonin. There's another aspect to the pineal gland, which I think is very strong in its favor, and that is it appears to be the #1 peptide for lengthening telomeres.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is a big thing at the moment. That telomeres being the end caps on our chromosomes, once described as the aglets on our shoelaces, which are those bits of plastic on the end. And you can imagine if you had no bit of plastic on the end of your shoelace, it would be a mess, right? It'd be all frayed and a mess. And in some ways, they think that telomeres are doing that for the chromosomes. They're stopping them from unraveling. And there's a lot of evidence that the longer the telomeres are, the more healthy the cell is, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to, we can talk about the work of an American doctor called Bill Lawrence, who has been using these quote unquote Russian discoveries and Russian protocols in 130 American patients, most of whom, by the way, are actually medical doctors. So,
Okay. Very nice. Maybe he'll turn those MDs into believers that peptides could be, bioregulators could be the next wave and kick out big pharma. We won't need all of those Band-Aid medications.
I think so. And the other exciting thing is that these folks, if as it were, go home and they can incorporate this knowledge, their own personal experience into their own practices. Because number one, I've been messing about with anti-aging medicine now for more than 30 years. And the number one problem we have is I have someone come to me and say, oh, that was great. I was really excited. I really want to do that. Is there a doctor in my area that can help me? And then I say, well, where do you live? And they go, Paris, New York, I don't know, Amsterdam, out of Mongolia. The problem is, how do we get people within a reasonable distance that can help folks?
Right.
That's one of the classic problems we have.
Absolutely. Okay, so you mentioned anti-aging, Phil, so I have to go down that rabbit hole and steer just a little tiny bit off the thyroid bioregulators. I always say that I don't care if I live to be 95 or 100. I'll live till 80, but I want to look like this. I want to look young. So what bioregulators would you recommend for us that want to truly anti-age, not just live longer?
No, that's the $64 billion question, isn't it? Oh, it's probably
Right.
$64 trillion question in this days, with the inflation we have at the moment. But no, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think if you want to keep it to peptide bioregulators, I think the pioneers there. I think the pioneers there, keeping all cells younger, healthier by elongated telomeres fundamentally. And I should make reference here to a very, very large human trial that was conducted in the Soviet Union. They've done a few, they've done 3 or 4, but the biggest one was 11,000 workers, factory oil and gas workers living in Siberia, right? Which is tough, right? It's not living in New York, is it, right?
Right.
So, they 8,000 of them were given peptides, and 3,000 of them were given vitamins, as you know. So in other words, a placebo, and they monitored these folks, believe it or not, over 12 years. Now they monitored a lot over 6, and then there was another extended period, and then I think a smaller number, but it was still 1,000 people even at the very end. But what they showed was, and don't forget, when people started, they were aged between sort of 40 and 60. So you had some of these people 12 years later, they'd well and truly retired,
Right.
and they were still following them. So what they showed was the folks on the peptides had 1/3 of the morbidity. So in other words, they had 2/3 less likely problems, and they had 1/3 of the mortality. So if you think about that, being useful and being older kind of goes hand in glove. So I think there were 3 principal peptides that shone in that study, and that was the pineal, the blood vessel, and the thymus, because obviously thymus is greatly involved with immunity. So those three stood out. Beyond that, it's interesting to look at what the Olympic teams used, because of course these people were incredibly fit, incredibly agile, and they were using things like the muscle peptide. The men were using testes. I think some of the ladies were using ovary, and also fundamentally liver and kidney, and in some cases pancreas. But it does come down to you know, the trouble with anti-aging medicine is, where do you start and where do you end, right?
Right.
And everything in life is cost and convenience, right?
Right.
If it's super costly, you're not going to do it. If it's incredibly inconvenient, you're not going to do it, or unlikely to, right? So where do you start? Where do you end? I always say to folks, what's your weak point? If you know what your weak point is, you've got a bad thyroid gland, get it fixed, right?
Yep.
If you don't know what your weak point is, and you're perhaps not doing any testing, like you should perhaps go and find out what your telomere length is, what your DNA methylation is, etc., and
Mm-hmm.
other things. Look at your family history. What did mum and dad have? What did grandpa and grandma have? And stuff like that. And that may give you a clue to say, oh yeah, there's a lot of diabetes in our family. Oh, there's a lot of heart disease in our family. And again, address the weak point.
Right.
I would suggest. Offbeat, of course, there are different peptides, although I wouldn't say they were peptide bioregulators. For example, some of my own favorites are the GHRPs, that's the growth hormone releasing peptides. A couple of quick names for you: GHRP2, GHRP6, semirelin. They will encourage more growth hormone.
Yep.
This is more prudent to people who are older, right? I'm not talking about people who are 20 years old. It's
Right.
not going to do that
Yeah,
much.
they're
But
producing enough. They don't
if
need
they're
it.
doing all right,
Yeah.
right? But if you're way past 35, then it's going to have a big effect. Although there's a bit of a cut-off point. It is harder once you're in your 50s, I will accept that. But if you're sort of between 35 and 55, it will have the biggest impact. And what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have better skin, better hair, more muscle, less fat. It's a very powerful tool that we have in the box, no question about that.
What do you think about now? See, I'm going down this rabbit hole now. What do you think about CJC and ipamorelin as compared to the GHRP to GHRP6 and the semirelin?
I don't have a lot of experience with that. The only guy who I greatly value is an American doctor called Rich Walker. And Rich has done a lot of studies with different peptides, especially GHRPs. And the interesting thing, the most interesting thing in my book with GHRP2, GHRP6, and I can't speak for the others entirely, and I hope, well, they might be, but I don't know. And that is that, so for example, if this is a graph and on the bottom we've got time, and on the vertical axis we've got the amount of growth hormone, or IGF-1, in blood, okay, in a normal course of a day, 24 hours on this clock, we'd see a bit of a spike in the morning, because that's the get up and go impetus, right? Here's daylight, let's get going. And then we would see several smaller pulse site releases of growth hormone during the day. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is why we don't like pellets, because if you
Yeah.
stick a pellet in your bum, then, I'm sorry, using a British colloquialism, um,
I love it.
um, you're going to have a graph like that. Well, what damage does that do? It's not bioidentical, right?
Right.
So, and of course, if you get up in the morning and decide to inject yourself with growth hormone, may even possibly a low dose, you're going to see what's so-called bolus injection. You're going to see quite a peak, and then really not much going on. Again, is it bioidentical? Does that make it safe if you do that for many years? Okay. Now, when you take, according to the work of Rich Walker, when you take GHRP2, GHRP6, and there's something a bit special about semirelin, which we can get into, what you see is exaggerated peaks, greater than they were before, but natural,
Mm-hmm.
identical. So I think, because it comes down to, like, and this, I'm stealing this from the great Jonathan Wright, Dr. Jonathan Wright. He always says, if we get medicine wrong, we have to ask ourselves three questions. Are we using the right molecule? Is it a bioidentical? Have we got the dose right? And the third one, which is the toughest one, have we got the timing right? Okay.
Okay.
So I think I know that makes it complicated, and I know everyone wants an easy way out, but it's what separates us from orthodox medicine, because what we're doing is highly individualized.
Definitely. I appreciate that. I really wanted to pick your brain on that. Now I promise I'll bring it back to the thyroid, but I wanted to pick your brain on that for sure, just to get the anti-aging piece in there, because my listeners know that I'm huge into anti-aging. So back to you had mentioned cost and convenience. Here's the thing about bioregulators. They really are convenient to take. So go ahead and go into the dosing. I find this fascinating because with supplements, as you know, you got to pretty much take them every day. I mean, yeah, you can do some cycling in and out here and there, but in order to get that therapeutic effect, if I want to raise your vitamin D level, I'm not going to be able to raise your vitamin D level by you taking vitamin D 10 days out of the month. It's not going to happen. So tell us about the dosing of bioregulators.
Of course, there are possibly different doses when people have medical issues, but we'll park those to one side and we'll talk about folks who are healthy but aging and they want to be a bit better, look a bit better, perform a bit better, or slow aging, or whatever angle we want to talk about. The typical way of starting on a peptide bioregulator is to take 2 capsules a day for 30 days. Okay. They call that the intensive course. All right. Now, and then that's it. You're not going to, in theory anyway, you are not ever going to take it every day again, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get the messages, which, just let me reiterate, are in food, are in plants, are in animals. We wrote, sorry, I'm going to flash a book at you. We wrote this scientific book, which is Peptides in the Epigenetic Control of Aging. We think these are the missing messages from food, okay, gene switches, individualized gene switches. So once you've done that first month, the typical regime, the 80-20 rule, in other words, 80% of people will carry on like this, is to take 2 capsules a day for 10 days in the month. So you are not taking every day. Okay. Now it's feasible that if you are a nice, healthy person and you just want to put the edge on things and you're really getting into preventative medicine, you can reduce that to 10 days every 3 months. So now they come in packs of 20 capsules, right? Which is a 10-day course, right?
Yep.
So now you're looking at 4 packs a year. Right.
That's crazy. I think that's so doable.
Right. And I'll throw a number out there. And I know it's not always good to quote money because times change and all the rest of it. And there are some differences between the peptides, but you're looking at about $40 for a box of peptides. Okay. So suddenly you might say to yourself, oh, $160 a year compared to some other specialized supplements that are out there seems like a bargain.
It kind of does. And even compared to copays for medication, it seems like a bargain. So how long, now I know everybody's going to be different. I know everyone's going to be, but how long approximately would it take for someone, let's say they even did the medical dosing, the more severe case dosing and taking it once a day for 30 days, maybe even once a day for 60 days, and then you start spacing it out. How long before they start to see a change?
Typically, depends on the patient, of course, depends on the peptide in question, but typically 1 to 3 months is an impact, will have some kind of impact. If people have medical problems, we tend to say stay on 2 capsules a day, and at least until such time as you've seen improvement. But no, I think in the majority of cases, 1 to 3 months. I've certainly known people who've done, say, before and after testosterone checks, for example, in men, and within 2 months they've said, I've definitely seen an increase, or those sorts of things. So it might be a bit long. I mean, the trouble with the telomere testing is most of the folks I know don't go and have their telomeres tested every month. They might do it once a year or something like that. Again, cost and convenience. No, 1 to 3 months I would say is typical.
And that's what we say for hormones. Even when we start using bioidentical hormone replacement, we say, you got to give it 3 months. When we start optimizing thyroid with medication, you got to give it 3 months. So that is completely doable and logical to give it a really nice chunk of time before you start to see results either in yourself or even results in your, as you said, your body temp or your lab. So that's completely doable.
Amy, I'd like to mention something here, if I may, that I hope will be able to stress. And that is coming back to the Soviet research or Russian research. What they said is that every cell every cell in our body has a biological reserve of about 30%. And the peptides seem to release or activate this biological reserve. And it seems to be across the board, i.e. in animals, in plants, and in humans.
Mm-hmm.
And Cavinson has gone as far as to suggest that if the maximum lifespan currently is 120 years, right, give or take, and that most people are living on average to about 80, even that difference is about 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So is it feasible that somehow these super centenarians are activating their biological reserves? Okay. And
Yep.
I very quickly will mention this, and what I'm about to mention is only months old, and it comes from Tel Aviv, University of Tel Aviv. They've
Yeah.
been doing experiments with some of these peptide bioregulators with strawberries. And they find that the strawberries that are using certain peptides, and forgive me, I don't know which ones off the top of my head, are producing 30% more fruit. You'll find that this number comes up again and again and again. It's quite extraordinary.
That makes complete sense because I have always thought this. I've never said it on a podcast, but when you think about aging, and just like you said, Phil, we really are meant to live to 120. Now, none of us can conceive that because you only see one or two people featured in the news for their 100th birthday, right? You don't see 100, 110. We don't see 120 ever in our lifetime, but that's what the human body was made.
Yeah.
It just makes sense that there's something being held back, be it our environment, chemical toxicity, the foods that we eat, lack of nutrients, whatever it is. So if this could be the key that turns on the ability to live longer, and like I said, you got to look good and feel good as you're living longer, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, so that brings me to one of my last questions for you. What about big pharma? So we already saw big pharma coming in. And what is tirzepatide? What is semaglutide? Now that they are the Beverly Hills soccer mom drug of choice for weight loss now, but it costs you $2,000 a month to do it because big pharma came in and said, look at that peptide, it works. Bam, now you need a prescription for it.
Yeah.
What are we looking at for bioregulators? Could that
Well,
happen?
who knows? They have got so much money, power, and influence across the board, as we've seen in recent events, and I won't get you delisted by mentioning them.
Right.
And the craziness of all that, you know. Um, so it could happen, but there is one prevailing advantage to these bioregulators. They are in food. Okay.
Yeah.
And it although they could try and stamp out the supplements as food supplements or whatever, because the bottom line with most of the world's authorities is they accept that food supplements exist, but they do not want them to do anything. And they certainly don't want you to mention a medical problem when you mention the food supplement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the challenges. The whole nutritional world knows that it's a challenge. How the hell do you tell people that vitamin C's got certain advantages for them?
Right.
That's the challenge that everybody in the industry is aware of. So it is going to be very, very difficult to put an outright ban on, as I say, substances. Some of the peptides that are out there on the market right now would have a hard job, a very hard job, to justify themselves under the Dietary Health and Supplement Act, right?
Yeah.
But these peptides can justify themselves under in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, could have a justification. So I think it will be harder for them. Just very quickly, I'm sorry to take too much of your time up, but
Right.
I just wanted to mention a study that came out of Amsterdam in 2016. They had a bunch of ladies, 10 or 12, that were all centenarians. Every one of those ladies was over 100. One lady was what they call a super centenarian, which means she was over 110.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think right now in the world, you know, there aren't 20 people on the planet that are verifiably over 110. It's very rare to get to 110. Anyway, they had one lady that was. They every week they went to them and they took a small sample of their blood and they monitored their blood for stem cell activity and telomere length. what they found was in every single lady, and the eldest lady lived to be 113, they found that in the last 2 weeks of their life, 2 to 3 weeks of their lives, the stem cell activity plummeted, the telomere length dramatically shortened. So now the big question now then would be, is that cause or is that consequence? Okay, because nobody ever talks about death. Well, not never, but rarely talk about death markers. They talk about biological age markers, but there are also death markers.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so I know it's the other side of the coin, but
Yeah.
I hope that somebody finds that interesting.
That's very interesting. No, that's very interesting because I think the possibilities are endless
Mm,
with what Mother Nature is giving us because
yeah.
it's not going to come in the form of a big pharma drug. So,
No, and of course, if you think about most drugs that go into the body, they kind of crash and bash about, hoping to meet a receptor that they can utilize. And what other damage? When you've got a peptide found in food that has existed ever since life has existed,
right,
that's nano-sized and acts directly on genes, doesn't go to receptors, goes directly to genes. In fact, the Russians have got all these incredible slides, which you end up putting 3D glasses on to see the interaction between the peptide and the gene reacting. So, it's fundamental. Most drugs are treating symptoms and they're not treating the root cause.
right.
Most.
Absolutely. Well, Phil, I apologize for having to cut this short. I know we both have schedules here, but I want to bring you back on because I feel like we could talk for another hour and just go down a couple different rabbit holes we didn't even get a chance to touch on today. So, for those listening that are interested in the thyroid bioregulator, the Thyrogen, we have that on my store. And then we're going to have a link in the show notes as well to all of the other bioregulators that you can get from IAS, which is Phil's. This is like your baby, right, Phil? This is like your
Yeah, I've
yeah.
been doing it a long time, and it stands for International Anti-Aging Systems, and we
Mm-hmm.
nailed our flag to that post 3 decades ago.
Yeah,
So we like to think of ourselves as one of the pioneers in the field.
you really are. You really are. And I mean, there's a ton on there beyond bioregulators. So that's why I'd like to bring you back on and really go down the peptide rabbit hole. Some of the things that you have on there for thyroid are just fascinating. So we'll plan that out. We'll have you maybe just do a part 1 and part 2.
Thank you. And if anyone prefers a magazine type format, we have a magazine called Aging Matters, and folks can either buy them or they can download them free of charge. So look us up.
Well, there you go. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Phil. We'll have all of your info in the show notes.
Thank you.